Hello and welcome to In Search of More. My name is Hannah, and today we are talking about the best books of 2025. I read 125 books in 2025, and these are the top 12 with a couple honorable mentions in 4 categories: fiction, nonfiction, homesteading / cookbooks, and religious. So we're going to start with fiction and work our way through. First fiction book I loved in 2025 was Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Rose. This is the second book by her that I've read. The first one was Divine Rivals, which is the first book in this series. This is a really interesting take on war and love and complicated relationships. It involves magical typewriters, and it is heart-wrenching and interesting. It's got some mythology thrown in there. It is an amazing read, but it is not a happy-go-lucky read by any stretch of the imagination. So be prepared going into it. You will probably cry, but 110% worth it. Amazing books. The second book I read in the fiction category that I think people should read is A Language of Dragons by S.F. Williamson. I thought this book was super, super fascinating. It was a really interesting look at country alliance and interactions between people groups and assumptions being made, and also to what lengths will you go to protect the people you love, and what lengths will you go to save other people and to turn corruption on its head. Fascinating book. Not really what I expected when I got into the book, but I loved it. Really good, easy. Again, not happy 100% of the time, but a really good book. The last book in the fiction category was also one of the last books I read in 2025, The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England by Brandon Sanderson. Now, this was my first book by Brandon Sanderson, and I loved it. It was a great introduction, being that it was a standalone, and I didn't have to prepare to read 5, 6, 7 very large books one after another. So in that case, it was super great introduction to his world building and writing style, and I loved it. It was a wonderful mix of future surrealism, and also yet deeply rooted in medieval history. It's an interesting dichotomy, and as it kind of switches back and forth and as more is revealed, it definitely stretches your brain. But the world building is glorious, and it is fun, and it is interesting, and it is very fast paced. And I really, really enjoyed it. So overall, all 3 of those fiction books were great. I reread a lot of fiction this year. I read a lot of my favorite form of fiction, which is dystopian thrillers with culty edges. But again, those are books that I just love for a light time. They're not necessarily books that leave me thinking for days afterwards, and these 3 were. We're going to move on to the next category, nonfiction. These books were definitely books that made me think a lot this year. We're going to start with Omnivores Dilemma by Michael Pollan. This is the book that really started the farm to table movement back in, the early 2000s, and it was a fascinating look at food and our food system and what we eat and what we think is good to eat. I have read a lot of other books on the topic, and it was interesting to come to this book as a later in my experience reading books on food and nutrition. It opened my eyes, but it is a very good primer to the subject if you're looking for an introduction into really kind of thinking about food outside of what is traditionally thought as good and nutritious. And also, if you want to take a deeper step at what actually goes into our food system, this is a really good book for that. The second book I really enjoyed in nonfiction was Ordinary Time by Annie B. Jones. This book was a much lighter read. It was interesting and thought-provoking, but it wasn't like one of the ones that gets in your head and keeps you wrestling with questions for days. It was just a sweet, encouraging read about staying and the ordinary parts of life and community. Definitely recommend. The last book in nonfiction that I want to talk about is Hannah's Children by Ruth Pakaluk. I believe that's how you pronounce this. This book is a beast. It is not a small book, and it took me quite a while to work through because of the depth of material. This is a deep, scholarly, interview-heavy book on families with large families. So families with lots of children. I believe the cutoff was 6 children was the smallest family she interviewed. And she spoke to mothers primarily about what it is like to have a large family in a world where large families are usually considered to be bad or not a good idea. And I loved her approach to this. And I also just really loved the different background of people that she interviewed, coming from all kinds of religious walks and social and economical classes, and so many different ways of mothering and experiences in mothering. And to hear kind of the resounding themes throughout, where they talk about like, yeah, having a lot of children is got its challenges, but overall the gifts outweigh the negatives. And there's so much that people miss out on when they only have 1 or 2 kids. Super, super fascinating, so thought-provoking, and just a really interesting read, especially living in a world where 1 to 2 children is the norm. I grew up in what I consider a large family of 4, and just to see the contrast between my lived experience as the oldest of 4 and some of these stories was just fascinating. And I love this book, and I definitely will reread it again because there's more in there that I definitely didn't pick up on the first read through. The third category we are going to talk about today is homesteading and or cookbooks. The first one is The Perfect Loaf by Mauriziio. And I hope I pronounced that right. Now, this is a very technical sourdough cookbook. If sourdough is intimidating or you don't have a lot of experience, this is not the book for you. But if you are really interested in sourdough and the science behind it and how it works technically, and just really honing into dough temperatures and feeding windows and just really understanding proper bakery style techniques in sourdough, this is the book for you. It is a beast, and the recipes are very complex as in number of directions, but very understandable through the writing style. That being said, it is intimidating merely because everything is very technically laid out. The second book in this category, Daily Sourdough by Lisa Bass, is 100% what I recommend to beginners. This is what my mom's working through right now. It is way more straightforward, much less fussy, much more of a home style, everyday sourdough cooking, as the name suggests. Amazing recipes, super straightforward, not too complicated or fussy, but a lot of really good recipes. So between those two, you should have pretty much everything you need to learn how to make very, very good, high quality sourdough. The last book in this category is The Cut Flour Handbook by Lisa Mason Zigler. I really enjoy this book. It's gorgeous. It's full of pictures. It is right up there with my flower books as well. This one really walks you through growing cut flowers at a version of scale that works for you. It's more aimed again at the home gardener, but the way she teaches, you could easily scale this towards production farming. It uses 2 beds, rotating. And again, this is for cut flowers, not pretty garden flowers. So the premise of the planting style is a lot packed in tight together with a lot of regular pulling off of blooms in order to really get volume out of a small area. Super great book, super understandable. And this is something I really want to put into practice and really have a constant flow of cut flowers at some point. Moving into my last core category, we're talking about religious books. Now, this was a really interesting year for me on the religious book front. I was looking through the book tracker that I keep. I take a picture of every book I read and put it in a folder. That is about as much as I do. But I was kind of flipping through to make this list, and I realized I really didn't read as many Christian books as I usually do. And that's something that I have intentionally changed in 2026. So I'll be really curious to see what my breakdown looks like next year. The first one in this category is Hard is Not the Same Thing as Bad by Abby Halberstam. Love this book. She is on Instagram as M is for Mama, and I really appreciate this book and its outlook on life. I am not a mom. I am not close to being a mom yet, but this book is really encouraging on just living life in general. Yes, it's geared primarily to parents, specifically mothers, but a lot of its philosophies and choices are good for all of us. Because in reality, hard isn't always bad. And just because something's hard doesn't mean it's not worth doing and pushing through and growing through, and to really embrace the hard and to not run from it, and to really understand the difference between life is hard and life is bad, and how that applies to contentment and just presence and just enjoying life in general. Super great book, relatively straightforward, easy read, something you could pick up, read a chapter here and there and not feel super overwhelmed by. The next book in this category is Well Lived by Sally Clarkson. This is, I think, came out last year, if not the year before. This is her latest book, and this book is very different than her other books. This is a little bit more of a coffee table or pretty book that is full of pictures, but the message is super good about what it takes to have lived a life well lived and what that looks like, and just stories of how she invested in and the things that her and her family chose, and then the fruit of that now, and then how she does those things and kind of the little tricks she learned along the way. Super great book. The last book in this category is by Sally's daughter, Sarah Clarkson. It's called Reclaiming. I loved this book. It was really interesting. Her writing style is I think it's super easy to read and very comforting to read. It reads very comfortably. It has a lot of stories mixed into the deep thoughts, and I love that. It's about reclaiming your life and what you believe and who you are, and very good book. Definitely would recommend. So those are my top 12 books of 2025. And now just a couple of honorable mentions. The first one is Frugal Woods by Elizabeth Willard Thames. I really thought this book was fun. My mom actually read it first, and she told me, and she's like, this sounds like you and Jake. And I read it and I was like, yeah, that's definitely kind of the life we like to lead. We like to lead a cheap, simple life so that we have the freedom and ability to do what we want to do. And that is 100% what this book is about. It's a memoir-esque, kind of talking about how they made their life into what they wanted and how they lived frugally to achieve that. Super easy read, super cozy, loved it. Another book that I read this year and I liked is Flower Lab by Adam Leonotti. Now, just like I said above with The Perfect Loaf, this is kind of a beast of a book, but this beast of a book is primarily centered along fresh milled flour. It is an out of print book. It is hard to get your hands on. I paid a lot more than I usually do for a book for this book, but it has been worth it. It is a really interesting book talking about flour, fresh milled flour, and how to cook with it in different places. So breads, pasta, and desserts. Super interesting, full of a lot of pictures and education. definitely if you're in the fresh milled world and you want to do a little bit more high-end fresh milled baking, this would be a good book for really kind of understanding that and how that's all going to work together. And then the last book is a reread for me, A Baker's Year by Tara Jensen. This is a book that every so often I see at the library and I'm like, you know what? I need to read this. Now, it is a cookbook, but it is also sort of a memoir wrapped into a cookbook. I read it primarily for the memoir-esque story of her life in baking, and I just find it to be just a super fun, cozy read in the fall and the winter, and just to hear her story and the story of the bakery, I really appreciate. So those are my honorable mentions for 2025. And I'm curious to hear down below if any of these sound interesting to you or would be something you would want to read. And if any of these you have read, what do you think about them? And I am curious to see what books are my favorite of 2026. And thank you for joining me. Until next time, have a great day.